I've been making comics and working on a project called the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which is a book form of all of kind of the exciting things about using comics in medicine. It's a collaborative project with 5 other colleagues, including Michael Green, who presented with me. That's been a big project focusing on. I also attended and presented at the annual Comics in Medicine conference, which was at Johns Hopkins this year. And just now I was presenting at the Association of Medical Illustrators conference, which I just learned today was directly the result of presenting at Transform. It's exciting, to be sort of able to articulate what you feel so passionately about and then have that be published. But then also bringing in the idea of using comics in this very serious enterprise too is really great. I think the thing about a manifesto is you want to make manifest something that is something you feel ownership of and that you feel passionate about. And so especially this manifesto, particularly because it's going to be the first 20 pages are an introduction in comic form that my colleague Ian Williams and I got together and did. And so it's a manifesto in comic form, which is fun. But then there's also scholarly essays, and there's also comic excerpts from other people's work that we think is really magnificent. And so it's a closing comic that is a collaboration of about 30 other people. And so it's a really kind of, I think, fun and groundbreaking work. And so I'm really excited about it. I fell in love with comics as a medium. I think the way that many people did as a kid. Your dad hands you the comics and they're beautiful, bright colors and they're fun to read and you follow characters from week to week. Spread it out on the floor, lie down and take it all in. And so, it always was a fun and safe place. I like bright colors, and so the Sunday Funnies were always something that was wonderful for me. For me, I think that comics are a safe place because I associate it with childhood. I associate it with a way of processing information and experiences that is manageable. And, that's what reading the comics every Sunday, it was the excitement of the story and the characters, and yet there was this safety and this comfort in it. And somehow the medium, even when I'm making a comic about a patient who had died and I'm really sad, somehow it still has that comfort and that safety for me. I was a big fan of Peanuts. And it's interesting because I've thought a lot about this because in my talks I talk about how comics are a safe place. And I realize that every generation will have their different touchstone points to the comics that made them feel safe. So, there could be Pogo if you're really old, and then, for some people it's Peanuts, and then for a whole other generation it's Calvin and Hobbes, and there's crossover between the two. And then I think I realized yesterday when I was looking at this, I need to catch up on what is in the paper now. I know some great stuff like Foxtrot and, there's some great stuff going on. I should probably tune in and find out what the younger generation is coming of age with. I got into comics out of necessity. I was working as an AIDS nurse, and the ability of words alone to help me cope with those experiences during the 90s when things were at their worst. Words alone weren't working anymore, and images alone weren't working, and one day out of desperation I just put the two together and put a box around it and then made another box and just kept going and found that the medium itself was incredibly helpful for me to be able to then kind of put some of my own thoughts and feelings and process and integrate experiences I've had that I didn't know what to do with otherwise. And then be able to be present to those patients I had that day or that week or whatever, because I needed to deal with my own stuff, and comics were a way that helped me do that. It doesn't feel overwhelming for me, and maybe that's a neurologic thing on my part or a neurologic difference between people, that I look at a piece of solid text, especially about something very serious, and I feel very overwhelmed. But especially something I'm supposed to be responsible for and learn or really want to learn about. But there's something about the small amount of text and the small amount of image and the use of the visual metaphors and then the box structure. I don't have to think about the whole story. I can just think about this little aspect of it. That those are the things that make me feel safe. And also, there's comics that are about horror, and so that's not safe, but yet somehow, I guess interestingly too, the medium, when you open a comic book, you can see if this is what's going to work for you, right? You can, by the visual style, as opposed to a book, it's all the same kind of, the font is different, but it's all letters, and so you don't, until you're well into a book, you don't know. Not that you rule out what you're not going to read, but I think you can get a feel for it very intuitively, quickly. I think some of the safety of comics comes from that. Specifically in medicine, I've been thinking a lot about how in a lot of graphic novels that people who have illnesses or family members who have illnesses, doctors and nurses show up as characters in these books because that's who they're interacting with. And having doctors and nurses read those books, I think, is really interesting because the patient is showing their perspective and they're showing how something that a doctor or nurse did was really not helpful to them. And there's a safety for a doctor or a nurse reading that. They can recognize, like, oh gosh, maybe I've done that before. Maybe I've said that in that way in that situation and never thought until I read it in this sort of safe way. I'm not being publicly shamed. This person isn't coming up to me and telling me that I did something that hurt them. It's sort of this safe way of sort of critiquing one's own practice as a healthcare provider because you literally can see how it impacts the narrative. And the facial expressions, this being a visual medium, the facial expressions after a nurse as a character says something. And so I think it gives that kind of safe feedback to healthcare providers to critique their own practice. None of us want to hear that we did something that hurt someone, but this is a safe way to sort of show that kind of thing unfolding. And actually, there's so much, you wouldn't believe the amount of theory that exists in the world now about those kinds of issues. And Scott McCloud, who wrote this book called Understanding Comics, and he did another one called Making Comics, but he actually shows, like, the more amorphous an image is in some ways, to some degree, the more a person can insert themselves and have this sort of what they call narrative transportation, that as opposed to something that's more photorealistic, well, I may not be able to identify with that character drawn photorealistically, but in some ways, in some situations, for some reasons, you might want to actually even just do stick figures because that lack of specificity can maybe help people to insert themselves into that situation. You mentioned comics that are very basic visual language. That has a resonance with us that's very different, and people like it. So I just presented to, these just staggeringly talented medical illustrators, and in my slides, I have this little funny drawing of a brain that I did, and they've done 3D renderings of the brain, and I'm thinking, I realized, like, that is irrelevant. I made a joke about it, but the bottom line is, again, I think that if your work conveys what you're trying to convey, if I look at that and I know that's a comic version of a brain, it doesn't need to have all the, calculi or whatever in the right place. That's not the point. And I feel like some of these 3D films and all that, it's like crazy accuracy for something that could have had the same effect in some ways in a simpler way. I don't think it's necessary to be an incredibly skilled visual artist to make comics. I use this with my medical students. We use very basic visual language. I have them start with crayons, because again, crayons are safe. People won't think you're judging them when they draw in crayons. It sort of levels the playing field. And so we do a tremendous amount of important work with medical students reflecting on what it means to be becoming a doctor, what it means to have that kind of connection with your patient. And we do that all in crayons, because that's a way that works. And but to your point, that's one thing that's nice about comics is they're a democratic medium in that way. People are always saying to me, I can't draw. But if I have them in a workshop and I have them, before we even talk about anything, do a self-portrait, you've just proven you're wrong. Everyone has an innate visual language that they could use, and it would be nice if people engaged it, because it brings different things to the surface than using text, I think. I think one of the greatest obstacles of introducing comics into healthcare are the preconceived ideas and opinions that people have about what comics are, who they're for, and how they're not their thing and they're not for them. So whether it's someone who remembers, the McCarthy era and the comics code and comics as propaganda, and then they think that somehow will have some untoward influence on them, or people who think that comics are only superheroes, or people that think that comics are for children, and you are minimizing my struggle and my treatment plan by proposing that comics be used in this venue. I came up against that with a project I was working on. Someone felt very offended that I wanted to take his memories of the AIDS crisis and render them in comic form. And I respect that, I completely respect that, but I think the more people know about the serious graphic novels like Mouse and Mom's Cancer, and the more people have sort of a sense of it's the medium. Someone once said the analogy to film, if people thought that all film was Disney movies, that would be the same thing, I should say that in the reverse. If you thought of film and the only thing you thought film was Disney cartoons, then that would not be fair to film, right? It's the same thing with comics. If you think that comics is only superheroes, then you're really missing all the rest that this medium has to offer. I think when it comes to what I look at as great graphic medicine, so that's comics in the medical context or they're about health issues, I think that what I'm looking for is utilizing the medium in the best way possible to really show how the medium can do things that others can't. Like, for example, we have the convention of thought bubbles. So I can draw a comic about an interaction between a doctor and a patient, and in this medium, I can very easily show that the patient is not tracking what the doctor's telling them. I can use symbols to show confusion. I can have two parallel narratives and show that the doctor's not getting what the patient's saying and vice versa. So there's like, when I think about good comics in graphic medicine, I like ones that really utilize the medium for all the many things it can do in terms of metaphor and story, convention, and all that. So, there's a graphic novel called Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person by Miriam Engelberg. And it's a woman who had all these observations as she was going through her treatment. And her thought was, I'm going to make a comic about it. But she thought, well, I'm going to hire a professional illustrator. I'm going to work with someone else who can draw, right? And she just realized she didn't have time for that. And so she started just doing it herself. And it's amazing. And I can't imagine this book being the kind of power if it wasn't done in her hand. Art Spiegelman said when you see something written and drawn by the hand, you have an insight and there's a sort of empathic bond. Art Spiegelman didn't say that about the empathic bond, but that's sort of kind of the thought that there's this empathic bond that forms, and from their own hand, however their drawing style, as long as they're able to communicate the essence of what they're trying to communicate, that's what is important, I think. And that's what I think of as good comics. Are they getting at what they were driving at with that the emotion they want to convey, right? By the pacing, by how one panel leads to another, by, to me, and I tell my students of this, and I teach graphic memoir, and this is the only thing I'm really rigid about with my students is your text needs to be legible. That's the biggest thing to me. If I can't read the words, forget it. My process for finding the right stories are ones that I feel compelled to tell. So I found this medium because there's so much I want to process from experiences mostly in healthcare, but also in my life. As a complete narcissist, I'm just illustrating my own stories. I do things that people come to me, and if I'm intrigued, then I definitely will take it on, like the study at U of C. But I always make sure they know, like, I'm not very agile in my ability, technically. So I have one style, and if you like it, great, we'll do it. If you are looking for another style, I can tell you an artist who will be able to do that for you. So I don't take on a lot of stuff. And also, I went into comics because I have stories that I really want to tell, and I really have, I'm sort of like, it's the tool that works for the projects that I already really have, and so I'm very focused on my own projects. And like the Manifesto project was an extension of stuff I'd want to already be doing. It's like the kind of stuff I want to talk about and learn about in comic form. So, and we scripted it as a group, and so I was able to sort of script my own part of it. So I don't generally take on other projects, although I'm open to that in the future. Right now I'm focused on a graphic novel that I want to work on. One interaction that I had involving the patient experience and comics working together is an opportunity I had to create a comic for a study at the University of Chicago. They had this pre-existing study where they were trying to help patients transition to a new doctor when their old doctor in the clinic graduates from medical school. And they had done certain interventions, sent them a packet with lots of text, and it wasn't quite, people weren't opening it. It was kind of, the outcomes weren't as good as they wanted them to be. And so someone had the idea of, why don't we do a comic that sort of models what this process could look like? And in some ways, the comic was really about just having these strong visuals that might get them, put it on the envelope. Maybe this crazy thing will, they'll open it and they'll read the comic, but they'll also just remember getting the packet and remember the main idea of, like, you've got to schedule your new appointment and whatever. And so then this wonderful study team at U of C actually took that comic, used it, and then had some outcomes. And it showed that people had a way stronger recall because of that strong visual that was associated with the comic. So they were the characters, like the main patient character. And it was this, and the other thing was the comic couched the patient in an empowering role. Like, you need to be the teacher, and so you're going to have a new student. And sort of turned that around instead of, it had great outcomes, yeah. In Japan, manga is something that everyone does. Everyone uses manga, and it's got a much broader cultural acceptance. And in a lot of the bande dessinée, and so there's other cultures that have a more advanced perspective on this than we do. I think because we're so, we've got this history with the comics code, and then we've got this whole thing with the superheroes coming out of this country, that it's sort of everything magnets to that. I think one of the obstacles to introducing comics in healthcare is the preconceived notions people have about comics, that they're for children, that they are somehow trivializing the situation that they're in terms of their diagnosis or their treatment. I think if you can get past that and get people to appreciate all, as I mentioned, the conventions of this medium that can be helpful, comics can really be an amazing tool. But I see that as a big barrier, that people have these ideas of associating comics. Someone was just telling me today that her grandmother still associates comics as something that are bad for you from the McCarthy era. The whole comics code, and like, oh, that's a tool of propaganda, or, And then there's people who think like comics are all about just about superheroes, and I don't want to hear that. Comics are for children, and so I know that there's resistance in an adolescent population to say like, I don't need that. I want a book. I want, I don't need a comic. And then a lot of adults just think, oh, that's not my thing. I don't want that. I had a tremendous experience at Transform. It was a great opportunity to be excited about what the work people are doing and find inroads for connecting with work that I might be interested in, and sort of seeing how those things go together. There are so many projects that I think about in different contexts. So, for example, the Family Dinner Project was one that was talked about last year, and I think about that in different contexts and think, oh, that would be a great venue for this. And so it's just sort of planting the seeds. Transform is an amazing opportunity to be exposed to new ideas and to get excited about those ideas, and then be able to talk with people about maybe projects that you have in mind or ideas that you have in mind where they might come together. And whether that means going to speak to them and to their peers at their institution, and kind of seeing how those ideas can come together. And it's, the mission of Transform, right, is to think in a new way about what we do in healthcare. And being a speaker at Transform, I feel, is just an amazing opportunity to really just bring your A game and really take yourself to the next level as a speaker. People can learn more about comics for healthcare by going to, first of all, graphicmedicine.org, which is a website I co-run with its founder, Ian Williams, who's a doctor who makes comics in the UK. And when we redesigned the website, we really wanted it to be a portal for a resource, a portal for all of the resources available in comics and medicine. So we try to get everything we hear about going on, whether it's a web comic, a graphic novel, an online project, a presentation at a conference, or a conference that's coming up, and tag that with things that might help people find it. So say, for example, I'm a nephrologist and I'm curious, are there any comics about kidney disease? Well, it turns out there are, and there's an online comic, for example, about donating a kidney and that whole process. And so that's the kind of stuff that someone could just go to the search bar, look for that, and then have come up for them what might be of clinical interest to them. I've really loved being a part of Transform, and I loved the Center for Innovation and all of the work that's being done here. It's just really exciting to be able to bring together the sort of creative and imaginative ways of being in medicine, and the science and the necessity of what happens in healthcare, and just put those two things together. It's really powerful.